Well, May grew up in Kansas. May Day was just a day where we clipped little flowers and put candy in these little uh, construction paper things that we made and hung on people's door and rang the doorbell and ran away. So it wasn't like you put dog poop in a bag and set it on fire and rang the doorbell and walked away. You actually put a little basket of candy and flowers and we rang the doorbell and ran away. But May Day actually has connections to organized labor. Um, and so in the United States, this was the call, right? To get out there and agitate. And as you can see in these bullet points, there's some scary stuff being mentioned, right? 1 pound of dynamite is better than a bushel of ballots. Talking about, death. So these are the things that people were talking about. So Chicago was really on edge because, again, they have a large number of immigrants that have old world ties that, are really keen on the ideas of Karl Marx and socialism and Marxism. But as you can see, across the entire United States, 300,000 were impacted. But Chicago became the epicenter. And there was a whole lot of very, well, just incendiary type talk that was going on and making a lot of threats. And so I don't think any of these names, Albert Parsons or Johann Most or any of these guys, are going to be on the AP exam, but it was a serious situation. Well, on May 1st, okay, they all walked off the job, and the group agitating and assembling continues to grow larger on day 2 and day 3. Well, then some violence broke out at the McCormick factory, which makes agricultural implements for farmers. And that created the call to have a meeting. And so the night of, I think, May 4th, the day after the violence at the McCormick plant, there was this call to meet. And the mayor of Chicago, in fact, promised to be there. And essentially, they were going to protest police violence and the shootings that had taken place. I don't recall if anyone died at the McCormick incident. I'd have to go back and research that, but I know that there were some shots fired. So anyway, this huge group assembled, and it was peaceful at start, but then as other speakers took the podium, things started to, become more incendiary in the rhetoric. And then the police showed up, and they were all ordered to disperse. And so the crowd is, kind of murmuring, and the police are there showing, a strong force, a strong presence. And nobody knows for sure who did it. It's never been determined who threw the pipe bomb. But as the police were standing in their line, someone in the crowd threw a pipe bomb, which exploded, and the shrapnel hit one police officer in an artery, and he died fairly instantly. A number of others were injured. Well, of course, the police open fire, and chaos ensues. And in the aftermath, I think the total number over a 2-day period of police versus protesters, 7 police officers died, and somewhere between 4 to 8 of the groups that were there agitating were killed. 50 to 60 people in the crowd were injured, another 30 to 40 police injured. The bomb killed, I believe, 1 to 2 police officers. The other police officers were actually caught in friendly fire. What we have is about 15 people dead over a 2-day period of time. So the issue is, okay, we're going to have an investigation. Well, of course, in the investigation, you know, the fear among the general populace of these radical foreign-born anarchists blowing things up, that kind of becomes the headline of the day. And so charges are filed against some of the labor leaders. They didn't do anything related to anarchy and throwing bombs, but they were implicated, they were tried. Some of them are going to end up eventually being sentenced to death and executed. But the main thing that you need to get from this is that how does the general populace feel about the Knights of Labor? Because a lot of the individuals that end up, identified as leaders have published very incendiary publications and called for a lot of acts of violence and bombing. So anyway, what happens is the average everyday American connects labor unions, particularly the Knights of Labor, with foreign-born anarchists, right? So is that good PR? Well, obviously the answer is no. And so if you wonder why the Knights of Labor are no longer around, what's the inference? They got associated with foreign-born radical anarchist Marxist extremism and violence, and agitating for violence. So when the average American reads their newspaper headlines at the breakfast table, their conclusion is these are a bunch of, crazy foreigners that are going to destroy America from within. So are they going to get behind the demands of the labor movement? And the answer is no, right? Even though it all started as an idea for a standardized workday and a living wage, it got connected with violence. And so that's one of the things that's really going to hurt the labor movement in this era. Here you can see a monument to the events that happened there. Originally, the police put up a statue commemorating their acts of service, but because of vandalism, they ended up taking that out of Haymarket Square in the center of the intersection, and they moved it to the front of the police commissioner's building, but it still was getting, egged and things like that. So they now moved it into an interior courtyard. But it's not funny, but I hope you're making a connection to the last, as you've lived and experienced things with cities in turmoil and violent outbreaks and things. And to quote Solomon in Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun, right? We've been dealing with these things for a long, long time. It's not just something that's happened in your lifetime. So the point is, what is a rational, legitimate desire or goal gets lost in the violence. And you guys probably don't remember this, but in 2011 there was a big thing about Occupy Wall Street. And throughout the summer of 2011, people were demonstrating. Well, and they were essentially wanting to try to punish the banking and finance because of income inequality and all these types of things. And, there are some legitimate critiques and there's some legitimate reforms that I think are necessary that would be helpful to everybody. But when you leave a trash heap behind, right? The average American, when you are disrupting traffic so that you can't get to your job, you can be down with the protesters, but hey, I'm trying to get to work. Hey, you guys are filthy. You're trashing the city. And by the way, you're pooping on cop cars, okay? Nobody can get behind a movement. Well, you lose the message, right? You may have valid things that are of a concern, but when the average American sees you pooping on a cop car, you lose credibility. So I think that's an important thing to understand. So this is a second incident that we're going to look at, and we'll wrap up the discussion. Well, it's not a discussion because I'm recording my screen, but we'll talk about it when we get back to school. But look at this date, 1894. All right. You have to understand context. The Depression of 1893 created a significant recession, and it was big. 20% unemployment. The only higher unemployment rate we've ever had in the nation was during the Great Depression. Now, what's the difference of the Depression of 1893? It was a short-lived economic downturn, right? It didn't last 10, 12 years like the Great Depression. But for the brief period of time that it hit, it was bad. There were companies that went out of business. The National Cordage Company went out of business, which manufactured rope. Not a big commodity today, but back in the 1800s, that was one of the largest employers in the United States. Reading Railroad, if you played the game, board game Monopoly, Reading Railroad went out of business, right? 23 was significant. Well, the Pullman Company was based out of Chicago, and they manufactured sleeping cars. Trains had sleeping cars, and the Pullman car. Well, if you were traveling on a 6-day trip from Boston to Sacramento, you would want to stay on the train and use a train to get cross country that had a Pullman car because they were top of the line, right? Nice amenities. It's like a first class hotel on wheels, right? Well, during a depression, during an economic downturn, there aren't any orders for these Pullman cars. So what do you do at the Pullman factory? You have to lay off workers. Why? Because you're not getting orders for new cars. Well, like I said, there was 20% unemployment nationwide, and so the factory, the Pullman factory, and the workers got together and came up with a compromise. And the workers agreed that they would work fewer hours and take a pay cut so that they could at least keep their jobs. The catch was that a lot of the workers lived in the apartments, the tenements, houses that were provided by the Pullman factory. So the Pullman factory cut their pay, cut their hours, but didn't cut their rent. And so the workers went back and said, look, if we're going to agree to less pay and fewer hours to keep our jobs, you've got to lower rent in the apartments. And management refused. And so the workers went on strike. Now again, think about the demand. It's rational, it's legitimate. This is a picket line in front of the factory. And if you know anything about picket lines, if you try to cross that line, things can get violent. And the Pullman factory is going to end up seeing some violence. These are images of mobs that destroyed some train yards in the aftermath of the Pullman factory strike. So when you hear that these factory workers are making, well, may grew up in Canada, makes sense to you. So the labor union that represented these factory workers went to other labor unions and said, will you support this cause? And so the labor union of the switchmen said, we are definitely down with the struggle, right? Now, the switchmen are very important on the railroad. They handle the coupling and uncoupling of cars. And so they organized, they had a union. They heard about the Pullman factory issue, and so they said, we are going to support our fellow worker. Even though we're in a different part of the supply chain, we're going to support those workers. And so they refused to handle cars. They refused to handle trains that were pulling Pullman cars. Well, okay, so again, what's the context? It's a depression. And now you're looking at the possibility of national transportation being shut down, which is a very dangerous thing for the economy. So the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, he asked for his Department of Justice to intervene, right? The Department of Justice is headed by the Attorney General, who at the time was a guy named Richard Olney. Now, Richard Olney will not be on the AP test. He will not be on my test. But conceptually, what you have to understand is the president sends in his lawyer to negotiate a way to bring this strike to an end. Okay, so Richard Olney, the president's lawyer, he had a job in the real world before he went into the federal executive branch. He was a railroad attorney, right? He was a corporate attorney for big railroad companies. So, can you read the handwriting on the wall? This guy's friends, he schmoozes with all the executives. That's who he knows. And so, he threatens an injunction against the switchmen, which means if you violate his orders, you go to jail, right? And so the switchmen are now faced with, well, do I go to jail for these workers that are working in this Pullman factory that are on strike? I'm down with their cause, but I can't go to jail, right? So because of the pressure of the federal government through the Department of Justice, the switchmen start handling the cars again and the train starts rolling. Well, of course, what happens to the solidarity, right? It starts to crack. The Pullman factory hires scab workers, replacement workers who cross the picket line. Things start to break down, and that's when the violence erupts. But the thing you have to understand is this. Government, right? If the government is against you, it's very hard to win, right? So, what's the thesis of this little presentation? Labor unions were trying to bring about changes that were rational, logical, sensical, right? A living wage, a standardized work day, right? But these two strikes are not the only strikes, but they're the only two that you need to worry about for my class. They represent why the labor union failed to achieve its goals, and that it wouldn't happen until the 1930s that you finally see this realization of a minimum wage standard and a 40-hour work week or an 8-hour work day where anything over that you get paid overtime. And what is it? The Haymarket Square riot demonstrates that labor unions had this connection to foreign-born, radical anarchist, Marxist, communist kinds of thought processes. And so when bombs go off and you get violent and destroy property, it's hard to get the general public on your side, right? And if the general public isn't on your side, your movement is not going to be successful. And coupled with that is the fact that if the federal government is against you, it's going to be difficult to succeed in your goals. Well, who puts pressure on change, right? Think about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. It finally took nonviolent civil disobedience when you saw people having dogs sicked on them or fire hydrants or getting beaten down with billy clubs, and the general public saw that and said, you know what, that just isn't right. Then you start to see pressure on your politicians and governing authorities that say, you know what, my constituents are saying this isn't right, so we need to make sure from a governmental standpoint that we're doing the right thing, right? So you're going to have a written assignment related to this little presentation. It will be included in the email that I'm about to send when I attach this video presentation. So if you have questions, be sure to email me. Stay warm, stay safe, and as always, remember, APUSH students. Push it real good. Push it real good. Mr. Kingsley is out.